just looking at the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, for example, it is layered with exceptions. There are lots of commitments to free movement in goods and services. And if you read, the headline provisions in each of the sections, you think, oh my goodness, this is fantastic. There's going to be goods and services flowing across Canadian borders. When you dig down, the devil is in the detail, and you start to see all these sorts of exceptions, which make you wonder, is this really a full-throated commitment to free trade? And really, it isn't.
Welcome to Inside Policy Talks, the podcast of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'm Peter Copeland, Deputy Director of Domestic Policy here at MLI. Canada is a federation with enormous economic potential, but too often our provincial borders feel harder to cross than those in the European Union or other places like Australia. A nurse can move freely across the EU, yet a nurse from Saskatchewan can't instantly work in Alberta. A bottle of BC wine still faces obstacles on its way to an Ontario shelf, and businesses regularly hit a maze of differing provincial rules, certifications, and standards. These barriers aren't just inconveniences. They drag down productivity, weaken competitiveness, and undermine the original economic vision of Confederation, a Canada where goods, services, people, and capital move freely across provincial lines. As Paul Daly and Mark Mancini argue in a soon-to-be-released paper, our constitutional structure makes the path to true economic union much harder than people think. Federal unilateralism, they argue, is largely off the table, and the Charter offers no real help, and decentralized regulatory power means friction is almost built into the system. And that's what makes today's discussion so important, because these issues are front and center now in a big way, as they may not have been just years ago. We're going to unpack how far federal leadership can go on this issue, where provincial autonomy must be respected, and whether a joint federal-provincial agency built through interdelegation might be the only realistic way forward. So, before we begin, my guests today are Professors Paul Daly, Research Chair in Administrative Law and Governance at the University of Ottawa, and Mark Mancini at Thompson Rivers. They are both leading scholars on administrative law in Canada, and Mark is also an MLI Senior Fellow and my co-pilot on the Landmark Cases Council project. And together, Paul and Mark have produced a very ambitious, detailed, and deeply researched proposal for economic integration that combines and straddles and reconciles and balances all of these tensions in our constitutional architecture. So last but not least, before we begin, please remember to like and subscribe. It really helps us reach more people with these ideas. So Paul and Mark, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Peter. Good to be here.
So, question for both of you, or whoever'd like to take it. What are the underlying reasons Canada struggles so much with internal trade and labor mobility more, arguably, than many federations, especially, as I mentioned in the intro, compared to the EU and Australia?
Well, I think there are a few considerations. I would say, most importantly, Canada is a series of different governments, each with its own power over its own territory, and through really not necessarily through anyone's fault. These provinces, territories have their own legislation, their own standards. They want to further the interests of the people within their territory, and that introduces friction. I'd also say that, unlike other places like the European Union or even the United States, the Supreme Court of Canada has not been a driver of economic integration the way the Supreme Court of the United States has, or the Court of Justice of the European Union.
Mark, anything to add to that?
One thing to point out, I think, just to build off of Paul's answer, is that it's a consequence of federalism that we're going to have 10 different provinces with different regimes for property regulation. That's to be expected. But the Supreme Court, sees this, I think, as probably a good thing. And I mean, I'm reminded of one of Chief Justice Dixon's sort of famous sayings, which duplication is the ultimate in harmony. And that, I think, is if you think of it that way, then having 10 different economies that's the best, that's the most harmonious thing we can have. But as we write in the piece, and as we're going to chat about today, there is definitely friction that comes with that constitutional choice.
Okay, so why does this issue matter? Give us some concrete examples of what sort of restrictions and impediments exist in Canada because of our setup. Mark, maybe
Well,
we'll
I guess
start with
maybe
you.
Yeah, one of the so there are many different things that we're going to touch on today, but one of the things that I think is most acute or maybe most visible to Canadians is labor mobility and the requirements for different professions, certified and licensed trades that the provinces all have. Doesn't create a system of equivalency where we could have cross interprovincial labor mobility. And this tracks when it comes to Canadians' experiences with services in healthcare, in other areas. This is something that I think touches pretty strongly at the root of our issues with cross border mobility. So the services is a big one, I think, and there's many others, but I think the labor mobility is one that certainly is getting some attention in the provinces right now, in agreements between separate provinces that they're striking of their own accord. It's a big issue.
Great. Anything to add to that, Paul?
No, I just maybe introduce the distinction between tariffs and non-tariff barriers, right? So tariffs, obviously, very much in the news with everything that's happening with President Trump. There are no tariffs interprovincially, so goods can go from one province to another without any tariffs being imposed. But there are these other things called non-tariff barriers, which are like differing standards. So if you want to sell something you build something in your province, but then in the next province they've got different labeling requirements, or the container has to be made of a different substance, or the if you're a building contractor, the toilets on the building site have to be built to a different specification. These are the sorts of things that are non-tariff barriers, and they trip people up. They trip businesses up when they try to trade across provincial boundaries. So there's no tariffs as such, but non-tariff barriers can be a problem. They introduce friction, and they just make it harder for people to trade across provincial borders in goods and services.
Okay, that's a really helpful distinction and a good segue to where I want to go next. Try to understand where the problem lies. So you mentioned earlier on, Paul, that you know, uh, unlike some of our peer jurisdictions like the EU or Australia, our courts here have been reticent to promote economic integration. So, is it the fact that in Canada, in your view, it's the division of powers, provincial autonomy, or these non-tariff barriers that are more at issue, or is it even more recent political or regulatory dynamics? What are the main drivers?
I think there are a couple of levels um, constitutionally that are important here. One is the federal parliament has relatively limited scope to make laws about trade and commerce. So it can deal with interprovincial trade and it can deal with international trade, but when it comes to regulating local matters, the parliament can't do that. The best illustration of that is about 15 years ago, the Supreme Court decided a case about securities. So Parliament, well, the federal government was thinking, let's have a national securities regulator. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that because securities are inherently local. These are assets, stocks that you have in particular provinces, and Parliament can't regulate that. So that's one level. So the federal authority is constrained. And then the other level is that the provincial authority to regulate things that are within provincial boundaries is pretty broad, right? Provinces are able to regulate any sort of local matters, deal with anything in the province. And that means that they can set standards in relation to products and services. They can say, well, the labels should be this way, or the toilets should be this way in our province. And that combination of narrow provincial power and narrow federal power and broad provincial power gives you difficulties. And the Supreme Court has also said if those provinces are regulating matters of public health, they have made a good faith judgment that this is how the labeling requirements should be, this is what the container should look like, this is what the tire thread should be on the trucks that are passing through our province. They're entitled to do that. So that's the kind of the combination and the Supreme Court's interpretation which leads to friction.
Okay, that's really good. Mark, would you have anything to add to that or comment on, maybe more recent political dynamics? I mean, the question of jurisdiction and provinces or the federal government getting in one another's jurisdiction because it's politically advantageous, seems to be a trend to my mind anyway, but I'm curious for your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think two things on that. Number one, I think it's important to point out that when the provinces enact these standards, they aren't necessarily doing so for a malicious reason, or to strike at the heart of interprovincial trade, or to stop other provinces from enacting standards. Now, of course, we have had this kind of gamesmanship in our confederation before. The famous chicken and egg war between Ontario and Quebec in the later part of the 20th century, good example of this. But that isn't the way, like, I wouldn't say that's the normal run of affairs. When a province makes a good faith standard to make a label reflect certain things rather than others, that's a benign choice. And that's a choice that it's entitled to make. So I think that's the first piece of it. The second thing I think on your question, Peter, is getting at the interaction or the conflict that's taken place over the last, say, 20 or 30 years between the provincial powers and federal powers. And over the course of the 20th century, there's been a lot more intermingling of these powers. And part of that is driven by the theory of cooperative federalism, the idea that things are better when these orders of government can work together. Part of it is the Supreme Court's own recognition that it's good to have some sphere of influence protected from each of the, from the intrusion of each of the provinces in the federal parliament. This is a feature of, our current political discourse as well. And whether or not, so part of this, we pick up on this in our proposal when we propose the creation of a coordinating mechanism to deal with this cooperation, but in a more productive and unified way. So this is certainly a trend that you're pointing out. Whether or not we can roll it back is one question, but we think we can coordinate it, I think, in a way that's more productive.
Okay, really helpful context, gives us the lay of the land. I'd like to come now to where we are today, because these issues are very topical. On the campaign trail, just last spring, the Prime Minister promised free trade in Canada by Canada Day. And since then, Ottawa passed the One Canadian Economy Act and is working on implementing the free trade and labor mobility part of the act. There was an announcement just mid-November on that. So I want to get your take on this. What does it accomplish? What does it leave untouched? More to be done?
Yeah, I think we'll maybe start with the federal efforts on the Free Trade and Labor Mobility Act. This is a step in the right direction, but it's not a comprehensive solution to, I think, some of the friction that we've become used to in Canada. What the act does, in essence, is establish equivalency between licensing requirements for federal and provincial products, goods, services. And this is the sort of thing that when we're talking about friction in interprovincial trade or the trade of services, this is something that obviously makes a big difference. But the law is limited in what it does. So there are some exemptions from the law. Certain hazardous waste materials not included. All of the supply managed agricultural products, dairy obviously excluded. That's likely a political reason motivating that. And I think some of the missing pieces here is there's no provincial buy-in necessarily. And nor is there really an implementing agency set out in the regulations to coordinate this and to make this really work in reality. So I think it's missing some key pieces. It's a good step in the right direction. It's one I think we pick up on in our proposal, but it's lacking this implementing mechanism for coordinating mechanism that directly involves the provinces. And that's where I think our proposal steps in.
Yeah, Paul, any comments on that?
We can only salute the efforts that have been made so far. It's great to see the political will there. If you believe, as we certainly do, in the importance of frictionless trade within Canada, this is all to be welcomed. But the federal parliament, acting alone, can only do so much. It can waive requirements and it can set standards for federal law, but that's within that constrained authority that it already has. It's not able to establish nationwide standards. It's not able to say, here are the requirements to be a nurse anywhere in Canada, and that would allow you to qualify in one province and then move freely around the country. Federal
Mm-hmm.
Parliament can't do that.
Okay, so before we get into the proposals, various mechanisms, agreements exist already in the country aimed at these very objectives. We have an agreement on internal trade, Canadian Free Trade Agreement, various sectoral bilateral agreements. Why have they failed? I suppose you could say, they certainly do something, but perhaps not as far as you'd like them to go, to achieve this genuinely integrated national market.
So there are a few things. If just looking at the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, for example, again, salutary development, good on the federal government, provinces and territories for signing up to this. Couple of things. It is layered with exceptions. There are lots of commitments to free movement in goods and services, and if you read, the headline provisions in each of the sections, you think, oh my goodness, this is fantastic. There's going to be goods and services flowing across Canadian borders. When you dig down, the devil is in the detail, and you start to see all these sorts of exceptions, which make you wonder, is this really a full-throated commitment to free trade? And really, it isn't. If a province wants to regulate, wants to maintain that autonomy to regulate, it has ample scope to do so within the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. There's also an absence of bindingness. There's no real mechanism for a centralized body, any sort of coordinating agency, to make rules and say, you know what, you have to recognize this particular standard. Right? This is the standard for nurses or containers or tire threads or building site toilets. This is the standard you have to recognize. There's nothing in there which allows that to happen. And then there's a dispute resolution mechanism, but that is one which has been very rarely used, and is not, you really want something a little bit more binding, a little bit more procedurally robust to really bring into effect the aspirations of that document. So again, the aspirations are there. The opening provisions have lots of aspirational language in them, but there's an absence of follow through in the detail of that agreement.
Mark, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think just to say two things about provincial efforts on this score. I think that's an important piece of the story. One way to look at this is that the provinces themselves, especially in the aftermath of the president's tariff levying of the tariffs and the threats, have stepped up to the plate to try to move the ball on this. And so I think of a province like Nova Scotia that removes Canada Free Trade Agreement exceptions and adopts mutual recognition between provincial standards. That's a good thing. But each of these provinces that have done this also build in exceptions into their own regimes. And so we do get a little bit of the Swiss cheese problem here, where we have a lack of coordinating mechanism for all the provinces. And so, for example, in Nova Scotia's law, has a commitment to labor mobility, but doesn't include coverage for healthcare workers. So that's a big piece. The other piece I think of this involving the provinces are the bilateral agreements that we've seen kind of springing up again in the aftermath of the president's tariff threats. And these two are, are hit and miss. So Alberta and Saskatchewan have a memorandum of understanding with Ontario about goods and services and equivalency, but that MOU is just non-binding. So we don't really have an implementing law there. The bilateral agreements themselves are going to be one-offs. One-on-one deals made between the provinces, lack of a whole of country or whole of government approach to that question. And so these, again, are good steps. I don't think we want to be seen as saying that these are not positive steps. They should be commended, but it's just these are all piecemeal. And what we're envisioning is something a little more holistic.
Okay, yeah, let's turn to this now. So what you are proposing is an administrative agency. Now, I think we're probably all not the types to wantonly suggest the creation of agencies, but I know this government, for one, loves it. They've already created a lot of agencies, so what's another one? And it's on, I think it has the right aims and objectives. So I'd love to hear your brief elevator pitch here or description of what you're proposing.
Well, the one of the ironies here, I suppose, is that when you want to deregulate, you want to take away regulatory barriers, you do need some kind of mechanism to take that away, and you do need to deal with the fundamental problem that Mark, really nicely identified, which is a coordination problem. There can be all the will in the world for provinces and the federal government to want to reduce tariff barriers, but if there is non-tariff barriers, but if there is no centralized body with any sort of control or oversight, what you're going to get is what we have, which is a mosaic of different provisions. So what we need is some sort of centralized coordinating body empowered both by Parliament and by the provinces. Let's be clear, there has to be countrywide buy in on this, empowered to set standards, require recognition, harmonize where necessary, and do that countrywide. In order to deal with the proliferation of non tariff barriers, there is a need for some sort of centralized agency that can raise them to the ground if you if you'll permit a slightly aggressive metaphor.
Mark, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think, I understand and I share the reticence about the creation of a new regulatory agency for the sake of a new regulatory agency. It's not a button that we should press just for the sake of pressing it. And, I think you're right to say that the current federal government, this has been its way of operation on a lot of issues. But I think what we're proposing here is not an agency for the sake of an agency, but an agency designed to do very specific things and solve very specific problems. And the specific problem here, as Paul pointed out, is the coordination one. Without a centralized agency that is empowered to do this, that has the buy-in from the provinces, we're not going to be able to get past this, this kind of these single instance bilateral or individual agreements made by the provinces. And so we hope that this agency is going to contribute both to harmonizing regulation between the provinces, but also recommending and creating an implementing mechanism for deregulation of in the provinces as well. So it's a specific thing designed to solve a specific problem rather than a button we're going to press for the sake of it.
Right. Okay. Narrow in scope. And so you mentioned buy-in being necessary for this, and the mechanism I think you lay out is this interdelegation concept. So wherein federal government and provincial entities jointly legislate, basically. So And in light of what you've already said about the different areas of jurisdiction that the provinces and the federal government have, and how the courts have drawn relatively bright lines in certain domains to delineate those areas of jurisdiction, how does this square with that? Like what jurisdiction is it ceding and giving to the federal government, and how does it work practically?
Well, it wouldn't necessarily be to the federal government, Peter, right? This would be a joint provincial federal
Emphasis
initiative.
on joint. Okay, yeah.
There'd be a federal there'd be federal legislation, but there'd also be legislation in the provinces as well. And what that would set up is something you have something similar in supply management. Ironically enough, speaking of regulation and things that maybe should be deregulated, supply management is an interdelegation scheme that allows Parliament to do things, the federal stuff, and the provinces to do the provincial stuff. And at the end of the day, what you end up with is a regulatory structure where you can flatten things out. You can make sure that standards are being respected across the country. So you can say to this agency, look, you can set a harmonized regulation for a particular thing. So we want to make sure if the agency thinks, look, we can make trade in goods and services happen more effectively by having a Canada-wide standard, they can do that. If the best way to do it is have what we call mutual recognition, so where a standard in one province, if you meet the standard in one province, you automatically meet the standards in other provinces. The agency can also insist on that. And also, unlike some of the mechanisms that are there already, it has the teeth, the enforcement teeth to back that up. So if my product is, I'm making it in Ontario and Saskatchewan, they're not allowing it on the shelves, well, I can go to the agency and the agency can actually take action against Saskatchewan, can say, Saskatchewan, you have to comply with the Ontario standard. Otherwise, it's going to be penalties to the benefit of the producer. So that's the sort of setup that we're envisaging.
Mark, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, so I think Paul's right to focus or to point out that provincial buy-in is going to be important here. But I think it's also important to say that we can get started with this agency and with the harmonization without total provincial buy-in right at the outset. We expect, I think that if there is sufficient provincial buy-in at the beginning, the provinces that are reluctant to join will later join, either because of the political pressure, either because people will be better off with harmonization rather than the single instances that we have now. So we do expect that, while there will be debate about buy-in, and in the end, it'll be like, a snowball rolling downhill.
Okay, so it's a very compelling proposal, especially the teeth and the coordinating capacity that it brings to the table. There are some common objections that are raised when aiming at this objective of economic integration, one being this risk of federal over centralization or just over standardization, as a single standard. And one of the consequences of that being a kind of lowest common denominator type of harmonization where, maybe safety or quality suffers as a result of some pursuit of a general standard. So how do you think this approach would deal with those objections? Mark, love to hear from you on that.
Yeah, I think we're worried about establishing a ceiling and a floor, and we're worried about we're going to go up to the ceiling and over standardize. We're going to go to the floor and under standardize. I think actually the virtue of a coordinating mechanism is it tries to get it to a Goldilocks where we're not going to have excessive over standardization because the agency that we envision is going to be empowered to not only harmonize but deregulate as well. And then also because of the provincial buy-in, I think that there's going to be less of a worry about going to the floor. because there'll have to be some coordinating among the provinces that exist, and that's going to prevent a ratchet down, I think. So this coordinating mechanism, I think, actually does a big part in making sure that we're in that Goldilocks area rather than ratcheting up where we have a federal centralized standard. That won't happen because of the provincial buy-in. And then the coordinating and harmonization will hopefully prevent the push downwards as well.
You have anything to add to that, Paul?
Just that, given Canada's history, I think the dangers of under-regulation should probably be, I don't think there's too much danger of that actually being realized. But this would be a scheme where there is consistent federal and provincial presence. It's not a unilateral scheme. There would have to be coordination. There would have to be involvement all through the process. When the Supreme Court, so the federal government came back to the Supreme Court a few years after the securities reference with a more limited model, which did have much more day-to-day provincial involvement, and the Supreme Court found that that was okay, that respected the balance of powers in the Confederation. So there's ample scope there. So, Mark, I think that the Goldilocks metaphor is very good. We want to get it just right, and it will be a constant process of getting it just right with both the federal government, provincial and territorial governments all in the room, trying to get the oatmeal to just that perfect temperature.
Yeah, no, they're great points, and certainly where we are today is on one side of that balance, and we can definitely move closer to where we want to go here. I do think that the wording chosen for this for how we want to achieve harmonization is really crucial here, and it's one of the selling features of mutual recognition that it's kind of like we're going to aim here, and you could even word it such that it's the default, and then you need to prescribe exceptions if you want to have an exception in play that would move people kind of automatically to that point of harmonization or recognizing different standards. And so yes, certainly agree we can move in that direction. What about the idea that with yet more bureaucracy here, this could weigh us down? I mean, the federal government has just, with work of the provinces, put forward the regulations under their Mobility Act that suggest, anyway, that many goods and services they're going to be accepted across the board. Do you think there's any issue associated with that here, or and curious for your thoughts, Paul? Maybe we'll start with you.
Well, look, we are in a system where there is a mosaic of competing standards. I think we would love for there to be deregulation, but deregulation, a bonfire of regulations occurring across Canada, very difficult to coordinate and to ensure that will actually happen in the systematic way it needs to happen in order for trade barriers to be internal trade barriers to be removed. So hence the idea that what we need is some sort of coordinating mechanism. Yes, there's always a danger of getting over bureaucratic, and yes, in a perfect world, if your interest is in deregulation, you just deregulate. But we live in a complex federation. No one person or party has the control over all of the levers that you need to be able to pull in order to knock down those non-tariff barriers that are causing friction inside the country. And if we had a different constitutional structure, if the Supreme Court had gone a different way in previous decades, if the powers in the Constitution were arranged a little bit differently, maybe we wouldn't be coming to you, we wouldn't be coming to Canadians with this sort of proposal. But we are where we are, and we have to work within the constitutional framework and with the political realities that we have. And the answer, we think, is an agency. Sure, danger of it being, overly bureaucratic, But at the end of the day, coordination requires somebody capable of doing the coordinating, and in this instance, it's got to be a joint federal provincial administrative agency.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. I want to do one last bit of testing here on the idea. Um, you noted the European Union as a good example of a federal-like entity with very open movement of goods and services and labor. And when I think of the European Union, I don't think of economic dynamism, but perhaps those are for other reasons, not to do with the extent to which goods and services and labor can move freely. I wonder if you have any comment about the potential for this kind of centralizing effect, or even the idea that there could be disincentives to innovation that might arise from centralizing or rendering common standards as the default position. Like you get a lot of interesting ideas that pop up in this province or that province from them having different approaches potentially. Now that's not precluded by this approach, but I wonder if you have any comments on that. I mean, the EU was one example. You mentioned Australia as well. Curious for your thoughts. Maybe Mark, we'll start with you.
Well, I think just in response to that, I think I just want to highlight again that we are in the world that we're in, and the responsibility that's now placed on people like us that want to try to solve this problem is to try to design a system that is constitutionally compliant with our arrangements, but at the same time solves the public policy problem here. And so, in a perfect world, we might think that just pure deregulation is the right way to go. But the problem that we have right now is that there's no clear incentive for provinces to do this on their own. We might be able to elect governments that's their MO, but that's democracy. We may go there, we may not. This coordinating mechanism is really just that, a mechanism. Now it comes in the form of an agency, of a bureaucracy. But I think much is going to come out in the terms of reference for the agency, in the way that its statutory powers are developed and drafted, that is going to keep the focus quite narrow on this kind of coordination, on harmonization on one side and deregulation on the other. So again, I think we're trying to solve a distinct problem here that arises because of just a combination of institutional things: the Supreme Court's holdings, provincial powers over property and civil rights in the province, federal powers over interprovincial trade. And in the ecosystem that we're in now, this coordinating mechanism actually solves a big problem for us without requiring extensive or expansive statutory powers held by a federal bureaucracy. Because again, this is going to involve the provinces and the harmonization of their own standards as well.
Can I just add, Peter, before you before you defend, I want to put a word in for the European Union as someone who born in and grew up in the European Union. It's true that economic dynamism might not always be associated with the large economies in the European Union, but it wouldn't characterize the United Kingdom as a particularly economically dynamic place since it left the European Union. And it may be that France, Germany, and so on, their growth might have been even less impressive over the years had they not been in the European Union. One thing the European Union has been very successful at is dealing with embedded protectionist interests in local areas. So if you're a French union or a German manufacturer, you can have a lot of influence over what the French or German legislature does. But your ability to control what the European Union does, because now suddenly you're just one manufacturer across a union of nearly 500 million people, your influence is much reduced. And I think we could see the same in Canada, where there may be provinces where you have important sectoral interests, public sector unions, powerful, entrenched, embedded interests, manufacturing, and so on. They might be able to convince a province to go in a particular way, but they'd have a hell of a lot more trouble convincing a unified coordinating agency to go their way. And I think that is an important point in defense of the European Union and in defense in favor of a proposal like this one.
Those are excellent points. So turning now to the steps ahead, it's very interesting and exciting times on these files. There is, of course, the the threat and the presence of tariffs globally, and for us here in Canada, that is motivating a lot of the action that we've seen, in just the past year. The first paper in this series by Ryan Minucha was about mutual recognition, interprovincial trade. We've just had one on property rights. The federal government is moving on all of these issues in some way. But history tells us that politically and practically there are a lot of challenges to realizing these objectives. So, what do you see on the horizon here? Are you bullish or bearish on the prospects? And what do you think like the biggest hurdle is to implementing your proposal, or hurdles? I'd like to hear from you both. So,
Yeah. Well, I think that the devil is always in the politics, and so that's the first thing. Now, I'm more bullish now than maybe I've ever been about the government's the political will to move on these issues, and we've been sort of forced into it by circumstance. So, I think we want to see political will. Whether or not that comes is always going to be an open question, but I'm more bullish now than maybe ever about the possibility of that. I think the other one other risk or one other hurdle for the proposal is just what the provinces will do. So I mentioned that like provinces have their own interests, they have their own reasons for having their own regulations, protectionist schemes, what have you, and we expect that once harmonization occurs through this coordinating agency, there's going to be an incentive for the provinces to get on board. But this has been a common problem in Canadian constitutional politics for as long as the country has existed. And so I suspect there's going to be wrangling between provinces that at first don't want to get on board compared to others that do. I think we have confidence that the success of this, like the way that this regime works, it constitutionally compliant while solving the public policy problem. I think we believe that that's going to do a lot for provincial willingness to get on board. But we do expect, because this is Canada, that there is going to be jurisdictional wrangling about that, I think in the early days especially.
Well, the political will is certainly there at the moment to start to reduce these non-tariff barriers. I think 10 years ago, an idea like this probably wouldn't have got much momentum behind it. I think we're faced now with a reality that our relationship with our biggest trading partner, the United States, is fundamentally reorienting. It's the biggest shakeup to trade in Canada since the repeal of the Corn Laws. And I think there's an understanding across the provinces, across the federal government, across the political spectrum that we need to do something to make trade freer within Canada. And that's political momentum that we're trying to capitalize on. And I think the role that an institute like MLI plays here is by coming to the table with proposals that map out the route that politicians can take to get us to a desired destination. And I think it's all well and good to have the political will, but you also need to know where you can go with it, what the options are, what would a workable solution look like. And I think the fact that we're even talking about this is a really good sign.
Yeah, well, we're happy to play the convening and coordinating role in that regard. And I agree that the stars are aligning and the time is ripe for this. And, I can't resist, again, that the government does love agencies. But if they take this one up, it will be the best one that they've done yet. And they could eliminate the others, and this would make up for it. So let's
The
hope
agency
that
to end all agencies, Peter.
that could be the title. I think I quite like it. So with that, I think that concludes today's conversation. But Mark and Paul, any final words before we adjourn?
No, I think this has been a great conversation. This was a fun project to work on. I'm certainly someone came to Canada from the European Union, just couldn't understand that you can't buy BC wine in Ontario. Still can't understand it. And anything we can do to contribute to knocking down those barriers is all to the good.
Well, good. Well, Mark's in BC and we're in Ontario, so maybe he'll send us a wine if this if this comes through. Mark.
Yeah, I'm born and raised in Canada, and I've never understood this either. And so it's to contribute to this issue, I think it's been rewarding. I think the big challenge today, there's agreement across the spectrum that we need to do something on this, but the question is how. What's the policy mechanism for doing it? What's the legal mechanism for doing it? And I think what we hope in this proposal is that we've provided an answer to those questions. One that is legally compliant with our constitutional arrangements, but one that actually goes some way to solving this absurdity that we're pointing out about BC wine in Ontario. I think at the end of the day, that was our hope with this, and we put it forward, and MLI plays an important coordinating role in sort of getting the proposal out there, and that's what we hope to start a conversation on.
Yeah, well, very happy to. Very timely piece. Thank you both for doing it and for joining us today. I encourage everyone to check it out when it's released. And thank you both once again. And to everyone listening, I'm Peter Copeland for Inside Policy Talks. Take care.